Our troops in front, after a determined resistance, unable to withstand the force of the enemy, fell back, and some finally gave way. The plain to my front was covered with fugitives from all divisions who rushed through my lines and along the road to the rear. Fragments of regiments came in disorder and without their arms, and for a moment all seemed lost. The enemy's skirmishers had reached the foot of the rocky ridge, Little Round Top, and his columns were following rapidly. One is tempted to pause for a moment to contemplate the really hopeless situation of the Confederate battle. Already Sickles's 6 brigades had been reinforced by 10 brigades which had been defeated 1, 2, or 3 at a time, with losses to the reinforcements alone of 3,108 men and 5 generals. The 8 Confederate brigades had themselves suffered terribly and lost 4 generals. All had marched fully 20 miles within 24 hours, and the attack, much of it through woods and over rugged ground, had mingled commands and broken ranks. Infantry can never deliver their normal amount of fire except in regular ranks, shoulder to shoulder. When ranks are broken, the men interfere with and mask each other. To say nothing of probable need of ammunition at this stage of the action, one must recognize that now, as the 11th and 12th Brigades of the Federal reinforcements approach, the Confederate need of at least a fresh division is great. There are not only no reinforcements on the way, but none within 2 miles. Both Hill and Ewell have orders to cooperate with Longstreet's battle, but they are limiting their cooperation to ineffective cannonading of the enemy's entrenchments in their front, while the enemy is stripping these of infantry and marching fresh divisions to concentrate upon Hood and McLaws, and the 3 brigades of Wilcox, Perry, and Wright, which had supported them. But when these had carried the lines in their front, Carr's, Brewster's, and Burling's brigades of the 3D Corps, Hancock had brought up Harrow's and Hall's brigades of Gibbon's division, and Willard's of Hayes's division. One at a time, the 3 Confederate brigades were driven back with losses, already stated, amounting to 1,565 men. The 6 Federal brigades had lost as follows: Harrow's, 768, Hall's, 377, Willard's, 714, Willard being killed, Carr's, 790, Brewster's, 778, Burling's, 513, total 3,940. Net, it would be tedious to attempt to follow the artillery reinforcements which came to the aid of Sickles's corps, but Hunt, Chief of Artillery, in his report, mentions 11 batteries with 60 guns being engaged from his general reserve. In addition to these, the 2D, 3D, and 5th Corps had 80 guns engaged. Against these 140 guns, Longstreet had but 62 guns on the field, and Anderson's division but 7. The artillery on both sides suffered severely in men and horses. A number of Federal batteries were captured and held temporarily, but only 2 or 3 guns could be brought off the field. Hunt's report says, "The batteries were exposed to heavy front and enfilading fires and suffered terribly, but as rapidly as any were disabled, they were retired and replaced by others." Besides the reinforcements of 12 brigades already mentioned, including Crawford's Corps reserves, Meade had followed them with Robinson's and Doubleday's divisions of the 1st Corps, 5 brigades, taken from the lines in front of Hill's Corps, and with Williams's division, 3 brigades of the 12th Corps. 2 more brigades, Candy's and Cobham's, of Geary's division of the 12th Corps, were also withdrawn from the entrenchments upon Culp's Hill and ordered to the left, but they missed their road and did not reach the scene of action in time. These withdrawals left of the 12th Corps but a single brigade, Green's, holding the entrenchments upon Culp's Hill in front of Johnson's division of Ewell's Corps, who had been all day under orders to attack at the sound of Longstreet's guns. What they did will be told presently. All of these reinforcements did not become engaged. A part of Stannard's brigade recaptured 6 of the Federal guns, which the Confederates had overrun but could not remove. Part of Lockwood's brigade of the 12th Corps, who were raw troops, were led into action by Meade in person and also retook a captured battery. Most of these reinforcements came into view upon the crest, from the lower slopes of which Crawford's division now advanced in a counterstroke to the Confederate charge which had routed and pursued Ayres's division. The mere sight of the long lines and solid blue masses, which appeared to the Confederates as they cleared the woods and scanned the opposite slopes, was calculated to paralyze the advance. 10 fresh brigades were in position before them, besides the remnants of the 13 brigades which had been driven back. About 75 guns were in action, supporting this huge force. To this day, there survive stories showing how the Confederates were impressed by this tremendous display. One, still told by guides at Gettysburg, is that a cry was heard in the Confederate ranks, "Have we got all creation to whip?" And another of the time was that the Federal commander was heard to give his orders. "Attention, universe, nations into line, by kingdom, right wheel." Fortunately for the Confederates, the Federal counterstroke was confined to a very moderate advance by Crawford's division. Our disorganized lines made a show of resistance, but it only led to the loss of perhaps 200 prisoners from Anderson's brigade, which unwisely prolonged its retreat. The enemy, however, only advanced to the eastern edge of the wheat field, and the Confederates retreated no farther than the western edge. From those positions, the firing was kept up until darkness brought a welcome end. For in our worn-out condition and isolated position, we were in a very dangerous situation. Had Meade now ordered an advance, he would have found Longstreet's left flank in the air, and the whole line of McLaws's and Hood's divisions much exhausted and but poorly supplied with ammunition. The ground on the left was open, and the moon was full. There was certainly a great opportunity offered the Federal commander, with his large force of fresh troops in hand near the field, and only needing the word to go. It is now time to see how Lee's orders were being interpreted and carried out upon the left. The official reports are a painful record of insufficient comprehension of orders and inefficient attempts at execution by officers each able to shift the blame of failure upon other shoulders than his own. Between the lines, the apparent absence of supervision excites constant wonder. But everywhere that the troops fought their conduct was admirable. Ewell, as before told, was ordered to attack with Johnson's division when he heard the sound of Longstreet's guns. Ewell says that later his instructions were modified into making a diversion, but Lee's report does not recognize such modification. Ewell interpreted his orders as calling only for a cannonade. It must be admitted that any serious attack by Johnson would have been suicidal. The enemy's lines were of exceptional strength, which is noted in the Federal reports. Ruger, for instance, thus describes the position of his division. Breastworks were immediately constructed of logs, rocks, and earth along the whole line, and at the gap in the line caused by the swale, so as to give crossfire in front of gap. In rear of breastworks of 1st Brigade, about 75 yards and nearly parallel therewith, was a stone wall, behind which the 2nd line of the brigade was placed. In front of the line of the 3D Brigade, Rock Creek was from 4 to 6 feet deep, with muddy bottom caused by a dam near the turnpike. The whole position was covered with rocks. Added to these difficulties was the fact that there was but a single position where the Confederates could plant guns to fire upon this line, and that an inferior one, giving little shelter and exposed to an enfilade fire. It was so contracted that with difficulty 14 guns were crowded upon it, within about 1,000 yards of the enemy. It might have been foreseen that this battery, exposed to the fire of double its number of guns, would soon be put out of action. That was what happened, its commander, an especially gallant boy major, Latimer, under 21 years, being killed. Besides these guns, Ewell's diversion embraced 6 rifles in rear of Latimer at a range of 2,000 yards, and 12 more on Seminary Ridge to the left of Hill's artillery at a range much over a mile. Hill's artillery comprised 55 guns on Seminary Ridge, so the whole assistance given to Longstreet's attack between 4 p.m. and darkness by the other 2 corps was confined to an artillery duel by 32 guns of Ewell and 55 of Hill, mostly at extreme ranges. But the value of this duel as assistance to Longstreet was absolutely nothing, for it did not prevent the enemy from withdrawing troops from every corps in his line to repel our assault. This cannonading was maintained for about 2 hours, after which it gradually diminished until dark. Meanwhile, about 6 o'clock, Ewell had sent orders to each of his division commanders to attack the enemy's lines in his front. This involved for Johnson an attack upon Culp's Hill. The division had not been pushed close to the hill in preparation for an assault, although one had been contemplated all day. It now had a full mile to advance, and Rock Creek had to be crossed. This could only be done at few places and involved much delay. Only 3 of Johnson's 4 brigades moved to the attack. His official report says, "I then advanced my infantry to the assault of the enemy's strong position, a rugged and rocky mountain, heavily timbered and difficult of ascent, a natural fortification rendered more formidable by deep entrenchments and thick abatis, Jones's brigade in advance, followed by Nichols' and Stewart's. General Walker was directed to follow, but reporting to me that the enemy were advancing upon him from their right, he was ordered to repulse them as soon as possible." General Walker did not arrive in time to participate in the assault that night. By the time my other brigades had crossed Rock Creek and reached the base of the mountain, it was dark. His skirmishers were driven in, and the attack made with great vigor and spirit. It was as successful as could have been expected under the circumstances. Stewart's brigade, on the left, carried a line of breastworks which ran perpendicular to the enemy's main line, captured a number of prisoners and a stand of colors, and the whole line advanced to within short range and kept up a heavy fire until late in the night. As has been told, the whole of the 12th Corps had been withdrawn from the lines except Greene's brigade. This brigade was being extended when its advance was met by Stuart, who got possession only of empty trenches. Johnson's other brigades found the trenches in front of their approach held by Greene's thin line, but in the darkness of the woods, the steep and rocky ground, and the abatis and obstructions in front, Johnson's line was halted at irregular distances, and the attack resolved itself into a random and ineffective musketry fire. Nothing more was possible, and even had they found more trenches vacant and occupied them, Meade could at will concentrate ample force to drive them out. The more one studies the situation, the more strange it seems that Lee abandoned his first purpose to withdraw Johnson from his false position. Early's attack is next to be described. It, too, was isolated, inadequate, and unsupported. It necessarily failed. Both attacks were in progress at the same time, but Longstreet's, which they were intended to support, had already ceased. Like Johnson's division, Early was also short of 1 brigade, Smith's having been sent to guard the rear from the direction of York. Gordon also was not engaged, as Early soon realized that the attack was an isolated one and would be quickly repulsed. Early's report gives the following details. As soon as Johnson became warmly engaged, which was a little before dusk, I ordered Hayes and Avery to advance and carry the works on the height in front. These troops advanced in gallant style to the attack, passing over the ridge in front of them under a heavy artillery fire, and then crossing a hollow between that and Cemetery Hill, and moving up this hill in the face of at least 2 lines of infantry posted behind stone and plank fences. But these they drove back, and passing over all obstacles, they reached the crest of the hill and entered the enemy's breastworks crowning it, getting possession of one or two batteries. But no attack was made on the immediate right, as was expected, and not meeting with support from that quarter, these brigades could not hold the position they had attained because a very heavy force of the enemy was turned against them from that part of the line which the divisions on the right were to have attacked, and these brigades had therefore to fall back, which they did with comparatively slight loss, considering the nature of the ground over which they had to pass and the immense odds opposed to them, and Hayes's brigade brought off 4 stands of captured colors. General Rhodes did not advance for reasons given in his report. The maps show that Hayes's brigade on the right had only about 500 yards to advance over ground exposed to the enemy's fire. Avery's brigade on the left had a somewhat greater distance. Hayes reports his casualties in this affair as 181. Avery was killed. The casualties of his brigade for the 3 days were 345, of which at least 2/3 were suffered in this charge. Howard's report gives the story from the Federal side. The attack was so sudden and violent that the infantry in front of Ames was giving way. In fact, at one moment, the enemy had gotten within the batteries. A request for assistance had already gone to headquarters, so that promptly a brigade of the 2D Corps under Colonel Carroll moved to Ames's right, deployed, and went into position just in time to check the enemy's advance. At Wiedrich's battery, General Ames, by extraordinary exertions, arrested a panic, and the men with sponge staffs and bayonets forced the enemy back. At this time, he received support from General Schurz. Effective assistance was also rendered at this time by a portion of General Steinwehr's command at points where the enemy was breaking through. This furious onset was met and withstood at every point, and lasted less than an hour. It only remains to show why Rhodes failed to cooperate with Early and Johnson as Ewell had ordered. The fault was with Ewell himself. We have already seen that he had allowed Johnson's division to remain all day so far from the position which he was to attack that when ordered to advance, darkness fell upon him before he could reach it. Similarly, Ewell had allowed both of his other divisions to locate themselves far out of reach of the places where they were likely to be needed. Of his own motion, however, Early had advanced half of his division at dawn to the Federal skirmish line, and these 2 brigades were ready to advance when ordered. Rhodes had remained about the northwestern edge of the town, near where the fighting of the first day had ended, and was still there when the orders came to attack. He was already preparing to advance, having seen both infantry and artillery withdrawn by the enemy from his front to resist Longstreet's pressure upon their left. But his location was so unfortunate that in spite of this warning, both Johnson's and Early's attacks were begun and finished before Rhodes had reached the enemy's skirmish line. Finding then his opportunity gone, he wisely desisted. But as Lee and his staff during the morning had visited Ewell's lines, it is strange that such faulty locations escaped notice and correction. Rhodes's report not only shows the badness of his original position, but tells of an excellent one for the attack, which so far had entirely escaped the recognition of any Confederate reconnoitering officer. His report says, "Having to draw my troops out of town by the flank, change the direction of the line of battle, and then to traverse a distance of 1,200 to 1,400 yards, while General Early had to move only half that distance without change of front, the result was that before I drove the enemy's skirmishers in, General Early had attacked and been compelled to withdraw. But instead of falling back to the original line, I caused the front line to assume a strong position in the plain to the right of the town along the hollow of an old road bed. This position was much nearer the enemy, was clear of the town, and was one from which I could readily attack without confusion." Rhodes's description of his new position is of special interest. Taken in connection with his statement of the distance to be traversed by Early's charge, it shows the existence of far more favorable ground for an attack upon Cemetery Hill than is to be found elsewhere upon the Federal line of battle from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top. It was open to our occupation from the afternoon of the first day, when Ewell stopped the pursuit, and it must ever remain a grave reflection upon the Confederate conduct of the battle that the weakest part of the Federal position was the only portion which was not attacked. It will be more fully described in the account of the action on the 3D. Thus ended the second day, and one is tempted to say that thus ended the Battle of Gettysburg. For of the third day it must be said, as was said of the charge of the 600 at Balaclava, magnificent but not war. The first day had been won by 17 Confederate brigades of infantry attacking 13 Federal. The victory was fruitless because Ewell stopped the pursuit in full tide. On the second day, Longstreet, with 11 brigades in 7 piecemeal attacks, drives back 6 Federal brigades, which, being gradually reinforced by 18 fresh brigades, check the Confederate advance and recover part of the lost ground before night ends the conflict. Cooperative attacks by Ewell and Hill, ordered by Lee, failed to be effective because both Ewell and Hill had failed to have their divisions in proper positions for the charge long before the moment arrived, although each had had ample time. Chapter 18. Gettysburg, Third Day. In his official report, Lee writes, "The result of the second day's operations induced the belief that with proper concert of action and with the increased support that the positions gained on the right would enable the artillery to render the columns, we should ultimately succeed, and it was accordingly determined to continue the attack. The general plan was unchanged. Longstreet, reinforced by Pickett's 3 brigades, was to attack the next morning, and Ewell was ordered to assault the enemy's right at the same time. The latter, during the night, reinforced Johnson with 2 brigades from Rodes's and 1 from Early's division. This statement shows that the strongest features of the enemy's position were not yet apprehended. These were the ability of the enemy to concentrate their whole force upon any point attacked, and the impregnable character of the 2 Federal flanks. The 2 brigades sent from Rodes to reinforce Johnson were taken from the new position discovered by him early in the evening and already referred to not only as the most favorable, but as practically the only position from which the Federal line could have been attacked with any hope of success. The brigade sent from Early was sent from a force which could have effectively cooperated with an attack by Rodes. The effect of sending the 3 brigades was to emasculate the center of our line and to concentrate 7 brigades where they were utterly useless. Before proceeding, however, we may best here give briefly the outcome of Johnson's battle. He had been ordered by Ewell to attack at daylight, under the impression that Longstreet would attack at the same hour. In fact, however, Longstreet received no orders during the night, and the troops required for his attack could not be gotten into their positions before noon. Johnson, however, was himself attacked by the enemy at daylight at a point where he was still holding the trenches he had found abandoned the night before. He repulsed the Federal assault and attempted to follow the fugitives, but was repulsed. Heavy firing was kept up from behind rocks, trees, and parapets until near noon. Rumors of movements of the enemy upon his left, which afterward proved to be false, then led him to withdraw to the base of the hill, where he remained unmolested until night, when he was at last recalled to the west of the town. His losses were about 1873, showing that the fighting was severe. Lee's headquarters were beyond the Chambersburg Pike, about 4 miles by road from the scene of battle on our right. During the night, the Washington artillery was brought up and disposed with the rest of Longstreet's guns about the Peach Orchard, with the intention of resuming the battle in the morning. During the night, Longstreet had sent scouts in search of a way by which he might turn the enemy's left, and believed he had found one with some promise of success. Soon after sunrise, while Longstreet awaited the arrival of Pickett's division with Deering's battalion of artillery, intending then to extend his right, Lee joined him and proposed an assault upon the enemy's left center by Longstreet's 3 divisions. Longstreet demurred, and, as had occurred on the day before, some time was spent in discussion and examination. Although the opposing lines were in full view and easy range of each other, neither seemed anxious to begin an action. The enemy's guns were generally behind breastworks on the high hills and ridges, with ample covering in rear for their horses and caissons. Ours, posted before daylight, stood exposed on gently rolling ground about the peach orchard and vicinity. The enemy fired occasional shots, but not enough to force us to reply, and we were but too glad to be able to reserve our ammunition for more important work. Longstreet pointed out to Lee the enemy's position on the Round Tops and the danger of withdrawing Hood and McLaws from our right flank, which would be necessary if they were to take part in the attack upon the enemy's left center. Lee recognized the necessity and substituted 6 brigades from Hill's corps. His report says, Longstreet was delayed by a force occupying the high rocky hills on the enemy's extreme left, from which his troops could be attacked in reverse as they advanced. His operations had been embarrassed the day previous from the same cause, and he now deemed it necessary to defend his flank and rear by the divisions of Hood and McLaws. He was, therefore, reinforced by Heth's division and 2 of Pender's brigades, to the command of which Trimble was assigned. Longstreet further objected that the enemy's artillery on the high rocky hills would enfilade the lines assaulting the left center. Colonel Long, of Lee's staff, in his Memoirs of Lee, writes, "This objection was answered by Colonel Long, who said that the guns on Round Top could be suppressed by our batteries. This point being settled, the attack was ordered, and Longstreet was directed to carry it out." Longstreet, in his Manassas to Appomattox, describing the same conversation, gives further detail as follows. "I asked the strength of the column. He, Lee, stated 15,000. Opinion was then expressed that the 15,000 men who could make successful assault over that field had never been arrayed for battle, but who was impatient of listening and tired of talking, and nothing was left but to proceed." It seems remarkable that the assumption of Colonel Long so easily passed unchallenged that Confederate guns in open and inferior positions could suppress Federal artillery fortified upon commanding ridges. Our artillery equipment was usually admitted to be inferior to the enemy's in numbers, calibers, and quality of ammunition. Moreover, here the point selected and the method of the attack would certainly have been chosen for us by the enemy had they had the choice. Comparatively, the weakest portion of their line was Cemetery Hill, and the point of greatest interest in connection with this battle is the story of our entire failure to recognize this fact. The narrative may therefore pause while this neglected opportunity is pointed out. There was one single advantage conferred by our exterior lines, and but one in exchange for many disadvantages. They gave us the opportunity to select positions for our guns which could enfilade the opposing lines of the enemy. Enfilading fire is so effective that no troops can submit to it long. Illustrations of this fact were not wanting in the events of this day. What has been called the shank of the Federal fishhook, extending south from the bend at Cemetery Hill toward Little Round Top, was subject to enfilade fire from the town and its flanks and suburbs. That liability should have caused special examination by our staff and artillery officers to discover other conditions which might favor an assault. There were and are others still easily recognizable on the ground. The salient angle is acute and weak, and within about 500 yards of its west face is the sheltered position occupied by Rhodes the night of July 2nd, which has already been mentioned. From nowhere else was there so short and unobstructed an approach to the Federal line, and one so free from flank fire. On the northeast, at but little greater distance, was the position whence Early's 2 brigades the evening before had successfully carried the east face of the same salient. Within the edge of the town between these 2 positions was abundant opportunity to accumulate troops and to establish guns at close ranges. As long as Gettysburg stands and the contour of its hills remains unchanged, students of the battlefield must decide that Lee's most promising attack from first to last was upon Cemetery Hill, by concentrated artillery fire from the north and assaults from the nearest sheltered ground between the west and northeast. That this was not realized at the time is doubtless partly due to the scarcity of trained staff and reconnoitering officers, and partly to the fact that Ewell had discontinued and withdrawn the pursuit on the afternoon of the 1st, when it was about to undertake this position. Hence, the enemy's pickets were not driven closely into their lines, and the vicinity was not carefully examined. Not a single gun was established within 1,000 yards, nor was a position selected which enfiladed the lines in question. Quite by accident, during the cannonade preceding Pickett's charge, Nelson's battalion of Ewell's corps fired a few rounds from a position which did enfilade with great effect part of the 11th Corps upon Cemetery Hill, but the fire ceased on being sharply replied to. Briefly, the one weak spot of the enemy's line and the one advantage possessed by ours were never apprehended. In addition to the 6 brigades of Hill's corps assigned to Longstreet for his column of assault, one more, Wilcox of Anderson's division, was later added, making 10 brigades in all, of which only 3 were Longstreet's and 7 were Hill's. I was directed by Longstreet to post all of his artillery for a preliminary cannonade and then to take a position whence I could best observe the effect of our fire and determine the proper moment to give the signal to Pickett to advance. The signal for the opening of the cannonade would be given by Longstreet himself after the infantry brigades were all in position. A clump of trees in the enemy's line was pointed out to me as the proposed point of our attack, which I was incorrectly told was the cemetery of the town, and about 9 a.m. I began to revise our line and post it for the cannonade. The enemy very strangely interfered with only an occasional cannon shot, to none of which did we now reply, for it was easily in their power to drive us to cover or to exhaust our ammunition before our infantry column could be formed. I can only account for their allowing our visible preparations to be completed by supposing that they appreciated in what a trap we would find ourselves. Of Longstreet's 83 guns, 8 were left on our extreme right to cover our flank, and the remaining 75 were posted in an irregular line about 1,300 yards long, beginning in the peach orchard and ending near the northeast corner of the Spangler Wood. While so engaged, General Pendleton offered me the use of 9 12-PR howitzers of Hill's corps, saying that that corps could not use guns of such short range. I gladly accepted and went to receive the guns under command of Major Richardson. I placed them under cover, close in rear of the forming column, with orders to remain until sent for, intending to take them with the column when it advanced. A few hundred yards to left and rear of my line began the artillery of the 3rd Corps under Colonel Walker. It comprised 60 guns, extending on Seminary Ridge as far as the Hagerstown Road, and 2 Whitworth rifles located nearly a mile farther north on the same ridge. In this interval were located 20 rifle guns of the 2nd Corps under Colonel Carter. 4 more rifles of the same corps under Captain Graham were located about 1.5 miles northeast of Cemetery Hill. These 24 guns of the 2nd Corps were ordered to fire only solid shot, as their fuses were unreliable. There remained unemployed of the 2nd Corps 25 rifle guns and 16 Napoleons, and of the 3rd Corps 14 12-PR howitzers. It is notable that of the 84 guns of the 2nd and 3rd Corps to be engaged, 80 were in the same line parallel to the position of the enemy, and 56 guns stood idle. It was a phenomenal oversight not to place these guns, and many beside, in and near the town, to enfilade the shank of the fishhook and crossfire with the guns from the west. The Federal guns in position on their lines at the commencement of the cannonade were 166, and during it, 10 batteries were brought up from their reserves, raising the number engaged to 220 against 172 used upon our side during the same time. The formation of our infantry lines consumed a long time, and the formation used was not one suited for such a heavy task. 6 brigades, say 10,000 men, were in the first line. 3 brigades only were in the second line, very much shorter on the left. It followed about 200 yards in rear of the first. The remaining brigade, Wilcox's, posted in rear of the right of the column, was not put in motion with the column, and being ordered forward 20 minutes or more later, was much too late to be of any assistance whatever. Both flanks of the assaulting column were in the air, and the left without any support in the rear. It was sure to crumble away rapidly under fire. The arrangement may be represented thus: Brockenbrough, Davis, McGowan, Archer, Garnett, Kemper, Lane, Scales, Armistead, Wilcox. No formation, however, could have been successful, and the light one doubtless suffered fewer casualties than one more compact and deeper would have had. A little before noon, there sprung up upon our left a violent cannonade, which was prolonged for fully a half-hour, and has often been supposed to be a part of that ordered to precede Pickett's charge. It began between skirmishes in front of Hill's corps over the occupation of a house. Hill's artillery first took part in it, it was said, by his order. It was most unwise, as it consumed uselessly a large amount of his ammunition, the lack of which was much felt in the subsequent fighting. Not a single gun of our corps fired a shot, nor did the enemy in our front. When the firing died out, entire quiet settled upon the field, extending even to the skirmishers in front, and also to the enemy's rear, whence behind their lines opposing us we had heard all the morning the noise of Johnson's combats. My 75 guns had all been carefully located and made ready for an hour, while the infantry brigades were still not yet in their proper positions, and I was waiting for the signal to come from Longstreet, when it occurred to me to send for the 9 howitzers under Richardson, that they might lead in the advance for a few hundred yards before coming into action. Only after the cannonade had opened did I learn that the guns had been removed and could not be found. It afterward appeared that Pendleton had withdrawn 4 of the guns, and that Richardson with the other 5, finding himself in the line of the Federal fire during Hill's cannonade, had moved off to find cover. I made no complaint, believing that had these guns gone forward with the infantry, they must have been left upon the field, and perhaps have attracted a counterstroke after the repulse of Pickett's charge. Meanwhile, some half-hour or more before the cannonade began, I was startled by the receipt of a note from Longstreet as follows: Colonel, if the artillery fire does not have the effect to drive off the enemy or greatly demoralize him so as to make our effort pretty certain, I would prefer that you should not advise Pickett to make the charge. I shall rely a great deal upon your judgment to determine the matter, and shall expect you to let General Pickett know when the moment offers. Until that moment, though I fully recognized the strength of the enemy's position, I had not doubted that we would carry it, in my confidence that Lee was ordering it. But here was a proposition that I should decide the question. Overwhelming reasons against the assault at once seemed to stare me in the face. General Wright of Anderson's division was standing with me. I showed him the letter and expressed my views. He advised me to write them to Longstreet, which I did as follows: General, I will only be able to judge of the effect of our fire on the enemy by his return fire, as his infantry is little exposed to view and the smoke will obscure the field. If, as I infer from your note, there is any alternative to this attack, it should be carefully considered before opening our fire, for it will take all the artillery ammunition we have left to test this one, and if the result is unfavorable, we will have none left for another effort. And even if this is entirely successful, it can only be so at a very bloody cost. To this note, Longstreet soon replied as follows: Colonel, the intention is to advance the infantry if the artillery has the desired effect of driving the enemies off, or having other effects such as to warrant us in making the attack. When that moment arrives, advise General Pickett, and of course advance such artillery as you can use in aiding the attack. Evidently the cannonade was to be allowed to begin. Then the responsibility would be upon me to decide whether or not Pickett should charge. If not, we must return to Vi to replenish ammunition, and the campaign would be a failure. I knew that our guns could not drive off the enemy, but I had a vague hope that with Ewell's and Hill's cooperation, something might happen, though I knew little either of their positions, their opportunities, or their orders. I asked Wright, "What do you think of it? Is it as hard to get there as it looks?" He answered, "The trouble is not in going there. I went there with my brigade yesterday. There is a place where you can get breath and reform. The trouble is to stay there after you get there, for the whole Yankee army is there in a bunch." I failed to fully appreciate all that this might mean. The question seemed merely one of support, which was peculiarly the province of General Lee. I had seen several of Hill's brigades forming to support Pickett, and had heard a rumor that Lee had spoken of a united attack by the whole army. I determined to see Pickett and get an idea of his feelings. I did so, and finding him both cheerful and sanguine, I felt that if the artillery fire opened, Pickett must make the charge, but that Longstreet should know my views, so I wrote him as follows: General, when our fire is at its best, I will advise General Pickett to advance. Now, it must have been with bitter disappointment that Longstreet saw the failure of his hope to avert a useless slaughter, for he was fully convinced of its hopelessness. Yet even he could have scarcely realized, until the event showed, how entirely unprepared were Hill and Ewell to render aid to his assault and to take prompt advantage of even temporary success. None of their guns had been posted with a view to cooperative fire, nor to follow the charge, and much of their ammunition had been prematurely wasted. And although Pickett's assault, when made, actually carried the enemy's guns, nowhere was there the slightest preparation to come to his assistance. The burden of the whole task fell upon the 10 brigades employed. The other 27 brigades and 56 fresh guns were but widely scattered spectators. It was just 1 p.m. by my watch when the signal guns were fired and the cannonade opened. The enemy replied rather slowly at first, though soon with increasing rapidity. Having determined that Pickett should charge, I felt impatient to launch him as soon as I could see that our fire was accomplishing anything. I guessed that a half-hour would elapse between my sending him the order and his column reaching close quarters. I dared not presume on using more ammunition than 1 hour's firing would consume, for we were far from supplies and had already fought for 2 days. So I determined to send Pickett the order at the very first favorable sign, and not later than after 30 minutes firing. At the end of 20 minutes, no favorable development had occurred. More guns had been added to the Federal line than at the beginning, and its whole length, about 2 miles, was blazing like a volcano. It seemed madness to order a column in the middle of a hot July day to undertake an advance of 3/4 of a mile over open ground against the center of that line. But something had to be done. I wrote the following note and dispatched it to Pickett at 1.25. General, if you are to advance at all, you must come at once, or we will not be able to support you as we ought. But the enemy's fire has not slackened materially, and there are still 18 guns firing from the cemetery. I had hardly sent this note when there was a decided falling off in the enemy's fire, and as I watched, I saw other guns limbered up and withdrawn. We frequently withdrew from fighting Federal guns in order to save our ammunition for their infantry. The enemy had never heretofore practiced such economy. After waiting a few minutes and seeing that no fresh guns replaced those withdrawn, I felt sure that the enemy was feeling the punishment, and at one point, 4-0, I sent a note to Pickett as follows: "For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns have gone. Come quick, or my ammunition will not let me support you properly." This was followed by 2 verbal messages to the same effect by an officer and sergeant from the nearest guns. The 18 guns had occupied the point at which our charge was to be directed. I had been incorrectly told it was the cemetery. Soon only a few scattered Federal guns were in action, and still Pickett's line had not come forward, though scarcely 300 yards behind my guns. Afterward, I learned what had followed the sending of my first note. It reached Pickett in Longstreet's presence. He read it and handed it to Longstreet. Longstreet read and stood silent. Pickett said, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet knew that it must be done, but was unwilling to speak the words. He turned in his saddle and looked away. Pickett saluted and said, "I'm going to move forward, sir," and galloped off. Longstreet, leaving his staff, rode out alone and joined me on the left flank of the guns. It was doubtless 1.50 or later, but I did not look at my watch again. I had grown very impatient to see Pickett, fearing ammunition would run short when Longstreet joined me. I explained the situation. He spoke sharply, "Go and stop Pickett where he is and replenish your ammunition." I answered, "We can't do that, sir. The train has but little. It would take an hour to distribute it, and meanwhile the enemy would improve the time." Longstreet seemed to stand irresolute. We were both dismounted, and then spoke slowly and with great emotion. "I do not want to make this charge. I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it now, but that General Lee has ordered it and is expecting it." I felt that he was inviting a word of acquiescence on my part, and that if given he would again order, "Stop Pickett where he is." But I was too conscious of my own youth and inexperience to express any opinion not directly asked. So I remained silent while Longstreet fought his battle out alone and obeyed his orders. The suspense was brief and was ended by the emergence from the wood behind us of Garnett riding in front of his brigade. I had served on the plains with him and Armistead in 1858, and I now met him for the first time since Longstreet's Suffolk campaign. He saluted and I mounted and rode with him while his brigade swept through our guns. Then I rode down the line of guns, asking what each gun had left. Many had canister only. These and all, having but few shell, were ordered to stand fast. Those with a moderate amount of suitable ammunition were ordered to limber up and advance. During the cannonade, the reserve ordnance train had been moved from the position first occupied, and caissons sent to it had not returned. Only about 1 gun in 4 could be ordered forward from the center, but from the right, Major Haskell took 5 from Garden's and Flanner's batteries, and Major Eschliman, of the Washington Artillery, sent 4 somewhat to Haskell's left. Returning to the center, I joined the few guns advancing from the batteries there and moved forward to a swell of ground just west of the Emmitsburg Road, whence we opened upon troops advancing to attack the right flank of Pickett's division. Eschliman and Haskell to the left front of the Peach Orchard soon also opened fire. The charging brigades were now close in front of the Federal lines, and the musketry was heavy. As we watched, we saw them close in upon the enemy in smoke and dust, and we ceased firing and waited the result. It was soon manifest in a gradual diminution of the fire and in a stream of fugitives coming to the rear, pursued by some fire, but not as much, it seemed to me, as might have been expected. After perhaps 20 minutes, during which the firing had about ceased, To my surprise, there came forward from the rear Wilcox's fine Ala brigade, which had been with us at Chancellorsville and just 60 days before had won the affair at Salem Church. It had been sent to reinforce Pickett, but was not in the column. Now, when all was over, the single brigade was moving forward alone, and there was no one there with authority to halt it. They were about 1,200 strong, and on their left were about 250, the remnant of Perry's FLA brigade. It was at once both absurd and tragic. They advanced several hundred yards beyond our guns, under a sharp fire. Then they halted and opened fire from some undergrowth and brushwood along a small ravine. Federal infantry soon moved out to attack their left when Perry fell back past our guns. Wilcox moved by his right flank and, making a circuit, regained our lines at the Peach Orchard. His loss in this charge was 204 killed and wounded. Perry's loss was about proportional, with some prisoners in addition. While Wilcox's brigade was making its charge, General Lee rode up and joined me. He was entirely alone, which could scarcely have happened except by design on his part. We were not firing, but holding position to prevent pursuit by the enemy. I have no doubt that Lee was apprehensive of this and had come to the front to help rally the fugitives if that happened. He remained with us perhaps an hour and spoke to nearly every man who passed, using expressions such as, "Don't be discouraged. It was my fault this time. Form your ranks again when you get under cover. All good men must hold together now." I had with me as an aide Lieutenant Colston, ordnance officer of my battalion. At one time, loud cheering was heard in the Federal lines, and Lee asked Colston to ride to the front and find out the cause. Colston's horse was unused to the spur, and balking, Colston had a stick handed him and used it. Lee said, "Oh, don't do that. I once had a foolish horse, and I found gentle measures so much the best." Colston presently reported that the Federals were cheering an officer riding along their line. Lee remarked that he had thought it possible that Johnson's division in the Federal rear might have gained some success. Evidently, he was not yet informed that Johnson, about noon, had withdrawn to a defensive position. Kemper was brought by on a litter. Lee rode up and said, "General, I hope you are not badly hurt." Kemper replied, "Yes, General, I'm afraid they have got me this time." Lee pressed his hand, saying, "I trust not, I trust not." Colonel Fremantle of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards had also joined the party. We sat on horseback on the slope behind the guns where we could see over the crest, but the group of horses was not visible to the enemy. When all the fugitives had passed and there was still no sign of counterstroke, Lee rode off. I continued to hold my line of guns with few changes until after dark. There were some advances by Federal skirmish lines which we kept in check with our guns, sometimes having to use canister sharply. But the Federal guns did not interfere, for which we were duly grateful. During the afternoon I quietly withdrew guns, one at a time, sending them to be refitted, and by 10 o'clock our whole line had been retired about to the position from which the attack began on the 2D. And now that we have reached the turning point of our campaign, we may revert to some incidents of note in the progress of the battle. In speaking of our neglect to enfilade the Federal lines, it was stated that quite by accident a few rounds were fired during the cannonade which happened to enfilade a part of Cemetery Hill. In the Philadelphia Weekly Times of May 31st, 1877, Colonel Osborne, Chief of Artillery, 11th Corps, describes the cannonade, in which he commanded a little over 60 guns, and mentions this incident as follows. The fire from our west front had progressed 15 to 20 minutes when several guns opened on us from the ridge beyond East Cemetery Hill. The line of fire from these last batteries and the line of fire from the batteries on our west front were such as to leave the town between the two lines of fire. These last guns opened directly on the right flank of my line of batteries. The gunners got our range at almost the first shot. Passing low over Wainwright's guns, they caught us square in flank, and with the elevation perfect. It was admirable shooting. They raked the whole line of batteries, killed and wounded the men and horses, and blew up the caissons rapidly. I saw one shell go through 6 horses, standing broadside. To meet this new fire, I drew from the batteries facing west the 20 lb, Parrott battery of Captain Tarr, and wheeling it half round to the right, brought it to bear on them. I also drew from the reserve 1 battery and placed it in position on Tarr's right. Fortunately for us, these batteries, placed in the new line, at once secured the exact range of their immediate adversaries. In a few minutes, the enemy's fire almost ceased, and when it again opened, and while the fire was progressing, it was irregular and wild. They did not again get our range, as they had it before we replied. General Howard, in the Atlantic Monthly, July 1876, writing of this occasion, says, "One regiment of Steinwehrs was fearfully cut to pieces with a shell. It doubtless received an enfilading shot from the fire here described. The official reports enable us to identify this firing as done at a range of 2,500 yards by 3 rifled guns of Millige's battery of Nelson's battalion of Ewell's Reserve Artillery. Nelson had 3 batteries carrying 13 guns, and the 48 rounds fired by Milledge were the only shots fired by the battalion during the campaign. It was not, however, Nelson's fault, but his superiors." His report says, "About 12 m. I was ordered to draw the attention of the enemy's batteries from our infantry, in connection with Captain Graham, commanding Rockbridge Artillery, and fired about 20 or 25 rounds from a point to the left and somewhat in advance of Captain Graham's position. On Friday night, I encamped about 1/2 mile in rear of my position on that day. The ordnance report of the 2D Corps identifies the guns and gives the rounds fired as 48. Mention has been made of the 5 guns advanced by Major Haskell from the Peach Orchard and the 4 from the Washington Artillery a little to their left. These guns moved so far outside of Pickett's charge that they were able to fire obliquely upon the Federals opposing it. Haskell, on the extreme right, was even able to enfilade portions of the Federal reinforcements. The fighting here was almost hand-to-hand. The following account is given by Colonel Rice of the 19th Mass. "The men in grey were doing all that was possible to keep off the mixed bodies of men, who were moving upon them swiftly and without hesitation, keeping up so close and continuous a fire that at last its effects became terrible. The grove was fairly jammed, with Pickett's men, in all positions, lying and kneeling. Back from the edge were many standing and firing over those in front. By the side of several who were firing, lying down or kneeling, were others with their hands up in token of surrender. In particular, I noticed 2 men, not a musket length away, one aiming so that I could look into his musket barrel, the other, lying on his back, coolly ramming home a cartridge. A little farther on was one on his knees, waving something white in both hands. Every foot of ground was occupied by men engaged in mortal combat who were in every possible position which can be taken while under arms or lying wounded or dead. A Confederate battery near the Peach Orchard commenced firing. A cannon shot tore a horrible passage through the dense crowd of men in blue who were gathering outside the trees. Instantly, another shot followed and fairly cut a road through the mass." The official report of Colonel Abbott of the 20th Mass thus describes the same scene. "The enemy poured in a severe musketry fire, and at the clump of trees they burst also several shells, so that our loss was very heavy, more than half the enlisted men of the regiment being killed or disabled, while there remained but 3 out of 13 officers." The enfilading shots described by Colonel Rice doubtless came from the batteries under the command of Major Haskell. No official report was made, But I quote from a personal letter of Major Haskell some years later. Just before Pickett's division charged, you rode up, and after inquiring what ammunition I had, you ordered me to move forward with 5 guns, part of which were taken from each battery. We advanced about 300 to 500 yards when I saw a large mass of infantry to our left front, beginning to deploy, apparently to strike the right flank of Pickett's division. I at once opened fire on this infantry, which almost immediately scattered or withdrew, unmasking a large number of guns. General Hunt told me after the war there were over 20. In a very few minutes, these guns had disabled several of mine, killing and wounding quite a number of men and horses. Our ammunition being exhausted, I ordered such guns as could be moved to withdraw, ordering Garden and Flanner to return as quickly as possible with litters for the wounded and teams and limbers for the disabled guns. This they did, getting everything out. The 4 guns under Captain Miller and Lieutenant Battle fared nearly as badly. Major Eschliman, seeing that they were being rapidly cut up, withdrew them. But 2 of the guns, 3 of the teams, a lieutenant, and several men were put hors de combat in the movement. But one official report from Pickett's division has been published, that of Garnett's brigade by Major C.S. Peyton, 19th VI, who was the only field officer of the division not killed or wounded. Pickett wrote a report which reflected unjustly upon the brigades of Hill's corps, among which the break first occurred. Lee returned the report, asking Pickett to modify it, which Pickett delayed and finally neglected to do. I quote from Peyton's report, dated July 9th, as follows: "Notwithstanding the long and severe marches made by the troops of this brigade, they reached the field about 9 a.m. in high spirits and in good condition. At about 12 m., we were ordered to take position behind the crest of the hill, on which the artillery under Colonel Alexander was planted, where we lay during the most terrific cannonading, which opened at 1:30 p.m. and was kept up without intermission for 1 hour. During the shelling, we lost about 20 killed and wounded. Among the killed was Lieutenant Colonel Ellis of the 19th VAR. At 2:30 p.m., the artillery fire, having to some extent abated, the order to advance was given, first by General Pickett in person, and repeated by General Garnett with promptness, apparent cheerfulness, and alacrity. The brigade moved forward at quick time. The ground was open, but little broken, and from 800 to 1,000 yards from the crest whence we started to the enemy's line. The brigade moved in good order, keeping up its line almost perfectly, notwithstanding it had to climb 3 high post and rail fences, behind the last of which the enemy's skirmishers were first met and immediately driven in. Moving on, we soon met the advanced line of the enemy, lying concealed in the grass on the slope about 100 yards in front of his second line, which consisted of a stone wall, about breast high, running nearly parallel to and about 30 paces from the crest of the hill, which was lined with their artillery. The first line referred to above, after offering some resistance, was completely routed and driven in confusion back to the stone wall. Here we captured some prisoners, which were ordered to the rear without a guard. Having routed the enemy here, General Garnett ordered the brigade forward, which it promptly obeyed, loading and firing as it advanced. Up to this time, we had suffered but little from the enemy's batteries, which apparently had been much crippled previous to our advance, with the exception of one posted on the mountain, about 1 mile to our right, which enfiladed nearly our entire line with fearful effect, sometimes as many as 10 men being killed and wounded by the bursting of a single shell. From the point it had first routed the enemy, the brigade moved rapidly toward the stone wall, under a galling fire, both from artillery and infantry, the artillery using grape and canister. We were now within about 75 paces of the wall, unsupported on the right and left. General Kemper being some 50 or 60 yards behind and to the right, and General Armistead coming up in our rear. General Kemper's line was discovered to be lapping on ours, when, deeming it advisable to have the line extended on the right to prevent being flanked, a staff officer rode back to the general to request him to incline to the right. General Kemper not being present, perhaps wounded at the time, Captain Fry of his staff immediately began his exertions to carry out the request, but in consequence of the eagerness of the men in pressing forward, it was impossible to have the order carried out. Our line, much shattered, still kept up the advance until within about 20 paces of the wall, when, for a moment, it recoiled under the terrific fire that poured into our ranks both from their batteries and from their sheltered infantry. At this moment, General Kemper came up on the right, and General Armistead in rear, when the three lines, joining in concert, rushed forward with unyielding determination and an apparent spirit of laudable rivalry to plant the Southern banner on the walls of the enemy. His strongest and last lines were instantly gained. The Confederate battle flag waved over his defenses, and the fighting over the wall became hand-to-hand and of the most desperate character. But more than half having already fallen, our line was found too weak to rout the enemy. We hoped for a support on the left, which had started simultaneously with ourselves, but hoped in vain. Yet a small remnant remained in desperate struggle, receiving a fire in front, on the right and on the left, many even climbing over the wall and fighting the enemy in his own trenches until entirely surrounded. And those who were not killed or wounded were captured, with the exception of about 300 who came off slowly but greatly scattered, the identity of every regiment being entirely lost, and every regimental commander killed or wounded. The brigade went into action with 1287 men and about 140 officers, as shown by the report of the previous evening, and sustained a loss, as the list of casualties will show, of 941 killed, wounded, and missing, and it is feared, from all the information received, that the majority, those reported missing, are either killed or wounded. There was scarcely an officer or man in the command whose attention was not attracted by the cool and handsome bearing of General Garnett, who, totally devoid of excitement or rashness, rode immediately in rear of his advancing line, endeavoring by his personal efforts and by the aid of his staff to keep his line well closed and dressed. He was shot from his horse while near the center of the brigade, within about 25 paces of the stone wall. The conduct of Captain M.P. Spessar of the 28th VAR was particularly conspicuous. His son fell mortally wounded at his side. He stopped, but for a moment to look on his dying son, gave him his canteen of water, and pressed on, with his company, to the wall, which he climbed, and fought the enemy with his sword in their own trenches until his sword was wrested from his hands by 2 Yankees. He finally made his escape in safety. All accounts of the charge agree that its failure began when the advance had covered about half the distance to the Federal line. At that point, the left flank of Pettigrew began to crumble away, and the crumbling extended along the line to the right as they continued to advance until 2/3 of the line was gone, before the remainder, beginning at Fry's brigade, was finally absorbed in the collision with the enemy. That result was inevitable. Under the conditions, it should have been foreseen. The Federal line on our left overlapped our line by nearly a half-mile. It was crowded with guns, and their oblique fire upon the unsupported left could be endured, but for a short period, particularly as several fences crossed their line of advance, causing constant disturbance of their ranks. The artillery of the 3D Corps, firing from Seminary Ridge, which had been vainly expected to silence this portion of the enemy's line, was now itself practically silent, on account of its imprudent expenditure in the duel. About 11 a.m. Lee's report says,